The wind howled through the cracked glass of the old pickup truck. Snow fell so thick, it erased the lines on the road. Calder Hayes squinted past the struggling wipers. Ahead, a silver sedan was tilted deep into a snowdrift, its hazard lights blinking faintly, a weak cry for help in the night. He pulled over, wiped the snow from his windshield, and stepped out, his boots sinking ankle-deep. The air cut like a knife. For a moment, Calder thought of his 6-year-old son waiting at home. Then he looked back at the woman shivering in the car, her face half hidden by a woolen scarf. "You shouldn't stop," a small voice in his head whispered. But he opened the door anyway, offering his hand. The woman's question hung in the frigid air, swallowed almost immediately by the wind's relentless shriek. Calder stared at her, his mind a blank slate. Her face, pale and framed by the dark, damp scarf, held no familiarity. He saw only the exhaustion in her eyes and the fine tremor in her hands as she accepted his grip. Her fingers were like ice against his worn leather glove. He shook his head, his voice rough against the gale. "I don't think so. We should get you out of this storm." He didn't have time for riddles when the temperature was dropping into the single digits. Duty, simple and unyielding, took precedence over curiosity. He helped her navigate the treacherous space between her car and his truck, his arm a steady presence at her back as she nearly slipped on a patch of unseen ice. The scratch, a jagged white line against the car's dark paint near the passenger door, caught his eye for a second. Fresh, as if the metal had recently protested against something unyielding. The cab of his Ford was a sanctuary of warmth and the faint, lingering scent of coffee and sawdust. The heater blasted on high, a rattling but welcome sound. She slid onto the passenger seat, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping her arms around herself. She never took her eyes off him. He closed the door, cutting off the blizzard's roar, and the sudden quiet felt heavy. "I'm Calder," he said, easing the truck back onto the barely visible road. "There's a blanket behind you." She found it without a word, a thick plaid wool throw, and cocooned herself in it. For several minutes, the only sounds were the rhythmic thud of the wipers and the hum of the engine. He drove slowly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his focus entirely on the swirling vortex of white ahead. "Ivy," she finally said, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "My name is Ivy Sloane." He nodded, glancing over. The silver bracelet on her wrist was delicate, a thin chain with a single intricate charm he couldn't quite make out. "My phone died, and the GPS must have rerouted me. I was trying to get to Northwood, to my sister's place." The explanation was simple, logical. It was a common story in these parts, where tourists and travelers often misjudged the ferocity of a mountain storm. Yet her initial question, "Don't you remember me?" echoed in his mind, discordant with the straightforward narrative she now offered. He decided to let it go. Shock and cold could make people say strange things. His house was the closest safe haven, a good 10 miles from the main town, and leaving her there was not an option. They arrived at a small 2-story house set back from the road, the windows glowing with a warm, yellow light. It was a simple, sturdy structure that Calder had built with his own 2 hands, a home that had seen more grief than he ever imagined it would. As he killed the engine, the front door opened, and a small boy with a mop of sandy hair pressed his face against the screen door, waving frantically. "That's my son, Theo," Calder explained. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Ivy's eyes as she watched the boy. It wasn't just observation. It was a deeper, more profound sense of recognition that made Calder's gut tighten. He pushed the feeling aside. He was tired, and the storm was playing tricks on his mind. Inside, the house was filled with the scent of chicken soup and the comforting clutter of a home with a young child. Toys were gathered in a basket by the fireplace, and a colorful drawing of a lopsided monster was stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. Theo ran to his father, wrapping his small arms around his legs. You were gone a long time, Dad. His gaze then shifted to the woman standing hesitantly by the door. Calder placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Theo, this is Ivy. Her car got stuck in the snow, so she's going to stay with us until the storm passes. Theo, with the unfiltered trust of a 6-year-old, gave her a wide, gap-toothed smile. Hello? Are you cold? Dad makes the best hot chocolate. Calder took her wet coat and hung it by the wood stove, the melting snow sizzling as it dripped onto the hot metal. He gestured toward the living room. Please sit down. I'll get you that hot chocolate. While he moved around the kitchen, measuring cocoa powder and milk, he watched her from the corner of his eye. Ivy didn't sit immediately. Instead, she stood in the center of the room, her movements slow and deliberate as she took everything in. She wasn't just looking, she was studying. Her eyes lingered on the worn floral pattern of the armchair in the corner, then drifted to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was crowded with framed photos. Theo as a baby, Calder's parents on their anniversary, a picture of him and Theo at a county fair last summer. But Ivy's gaze seemed to fix on an empty space next to them, a spot where another frame should have been. It was the place where his wife's picture used to sit. The sight of that empty space always gave him a dull ache, but Ivy stared at it with an unnerving familiarity, as if she knew precisely what was missing. Calder brought her the steaming mug, and as their fingers brushed, he felt a strange current pass between them, not of attraction, but of a shared, unspoken history he couldn't place. She took the mug, her lips forming a quiet, "Thank you," but her eyes had already moved on, scanning the hallway that led to the bedrooms, her expression that of someone retracing old, forgotten steps in a house she had, impossibly, been in before. The rich aroma of chicken soup filled the small kitchen, a comforting scent that battled the storm's lingering chill. Calder ladled the soup into 3 bowls while Ivy sat at the small wooden table, watching him with a quiet intensity that was beginning to feel less like suspicion and more like careful study. Theo, perched on a stool beside her, was a small, vibrant engine of chatter, seemingly determined to fill the silence she carried with her. He showed her his favorite dinosaur figurine, a green T-Rex with a chipped tooth, explaining its life story with the solemn gravity only a 6-year-old could muster. To Calder's surprise, Ivy listened intently, asking questions about the dinosaur's adventures with a genuine curiosity that made Theo's face light up. The easy, almost immediate bond forming between them was both heartening and strange. Theo was usually shy around new people, but with Ivy, he was an open book. "Dad built this table," Theo announced proudly, patting the worn pine surface. "And the chairs. He can fix anything." Ivy ran her fingers along the edge of the wood, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "Yes," she said softly, her gaze drifting around the room. "He's very good with his hands." It was a simple observation, yet it felt weighted, as if she were confirming a fact she already knew. Calder set the bowls on the table, the steam rising in fragrant clouds. The house felt smaller with a guest in it, the familiar spaces reconfigured by her presence. He found himself noticing things he usually overlooked, the slight squeak of the 3rd floorboard from the kitchen to the living room, the way the faucet in the sink dripped once every 30 seconds, the faded photograph on the wall of a family that was no longer whole. As they ate, the conversation remained anchored by Theo. He recounted his day at school, the epic snowball fight during recess, and the book about a friendly bear his teacher had read. Calder watched Ivy over the rim of his spoon. She was a puzzle. One moment, she was a vulnerable stranger, lost and shivering. The next, she seemed to possess an unnerving familiarity with his life. When she reached for the salt shaker, the sleeve of her sweater pulled back, revealing the silver bracelet again. In the warm light of the kitchen, he could finally see the charm clearly. It was a small bird, a wren, its wings delicately carved. A memory, distant and hazy, surfaced in Calder's mind. It was from 3, maybe 4 years ago. His old truck had broken down on Ridge Road, miles from town, and his phone was dead. He had been frantic, knowing Lena was working late and he was the only one who could pick Theo up from daycare before it closed. A car had pulled over, and a woman offered him a ride. He remembered her kindness, the calm in her voice, and a flash of silver on her wrist as she shifted gears. The connection clicked into place, a plausible anchor in a sea of strangeness. "I think I remember you now," Calder said, setting his spoon down. "That bracelet. You gave me a ride a few years back when my truck died on Ridge Road. I was late to get Theo." He looked at her, expecting a nod of confirmation, a shared smile over the coincidence. The explanation felt right. It would explain her cryptic first words to him in the storm. It was a relief to think there was a simple, logical reason for this intersection of their lives. Ivy looked down at her wrist, her thumb tracing the outline of the silver wren. She didn't meet his eyes. "The world can be a small place sometimes," she murmured, an answer that was neither a confirmation nor a denial. Her ambiguity was a closed door, leaving him standing on the porch. He decided not to push it. Perhaps the memory was painful for her in some way he couldn't guess. He concluded that she must have known his wife Lena, too. That would explain her familiarity with the house. They probably met through some local club or charity event that Lena had been involved in. "Mommy loved birds," Theo said suddenly, as if reading his father's thoughts. He pointed his spoon toward the armchair in the living room. "She used to sit there and watch them at the feeder. She said wrens were the bravest because they're so small, but sing so loud." Ivy's gaze followed his finger, and a profound sadness settled in her eyes. It was a look of shared grief, of knowing precisely the loss they were all feeling. "She was right," Ivy said, her voice barely a whisper. "They are." Calder felt a pang in his chest. Did you know my wife?" he asked, the question now seeming obvious. Ivy finally looked at him, her expression a careful mixture of sorrow and restraint. "I knew of her," she said, choosing her words with precision. "It's a small town, Calder. It was hard not to know of Lena Hayes. She had a light about her." Her answer felt both truthful and incomplete, a carefully curated piece of the past. It settled Calder's immediate questions but planted a deeper, more unsettling seed. He was no longer just helping a stranger. He was sheltering a piece of his wife's world, a world he was beginning to suspect he hadn't known as well as he thought. The quiet of the house was no longer peaceful. It was filled with unspoken words, with the ghosts of conversations he had never been a part of. The world outside was silent, buried under a thick, undisturbed blanket of white. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a pristine, sun-drenched landscape that sparkled with a blinding intensity. Inside the house, a similar quiet had settled. Calder had been up since dawn, the rhythmic scrape of his shovel clearing a path from the door to the truck, the only sound to break the morning stillness. Ivy was still asleep in the guest room, and Theo was thankfully sleeping in, a rare luxury for a Saturday morning. As Calder brewed coffee, the rich, dark aroma filling the kitchen, his thoughts kept circling back to the woman in the other room. The idea that she had known his wife, Lena, had provided a temporary anchor, but the anchor was dragging. Lena had never mentioned an Ivy Sloane, and she had been an open person, rarely keeping secrets. The coincidence of the roadside assistance years ago and her appearance in the storm felt too neat, too scripted. He was a man who believed in cause and effect, in the logical progression of things. This felt like a page torn from someone else's book, inserted randomly into his own. When Ivy finally emerged, her hair was damp from a shower, and she was wearing a spare set of sweatpants and a thick sweater Calder had left out for her. She looked less like a victim of the storm and more like a person trying to remember how to inhabit a space. She moved with a hesitant grace, her eyes still taking in the details of the house, as if they held a secret language she was trying to decipher. "The coffee smells wonderful," she said, her voice a little stronger than the night before. He poured her a mug, and they stood by the window, watching the sunlight glint off the snow-laden pines. "I used to live here," she said, her gaze fixed on the distant, snow-capped peak of Mount Harrison. "A long time ago. I grew up just on the other side of this valley." The admission was dropped casually, but it landed with the weight of a stone in Calder's gut. It explained her familiarity, her strange sense of belonging, but it also opened a dozen new, more troubling questions. Later that afternoon, while Theo was engrossed in building a sprawling fortress of pillows and blankets in the living room, Calder retreated to his small office in the back of the house. He told himself he was just checking on work emails, but it was a lie. He turned on his old desktop computer, the fan whirring to life in the quiet room. He was a plumber, not a detective, but years of running his own small business had made him resourceful. He had an account with the county's public records portal, something he used occasionally to look up property deeds and zoning permits. With a knot of unease tightening in his stomach, he typed Ivy Sloan into the search field. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. A past address, a marriage license, anything to fill in the blanks. The results loaded slowly, and his eyes scanned the list. His breath caught when he saw it. A civil court filing from 7 years ago. Malloy Development versus Sloan. The charge was listed as financial fraud. He clicked the link, and the digitized documents filled the screen. The complaint alleged that Ivy, then a junior analyst at a local investment firm, had manipulated accounts to embezzle funds intended for a major construction project headed by Grant Malloy, a prominent and respected businessman in the region. Calder remembered the name well. Malloy was a local magnate, a man whose name was on buildings and park benches, his influence woven into the very fabric of the town. Calder read on, his unease curdling into something colder. The case had been sensational for a time, a small-town scandal that filled the local paper for weeks. But according to the final entry, the charges had been dropped. A key witness had recanted their testimony, and the evidence was deemed insufficient. Ivy had been acquitted, her name legally cleared, but Calder knew how these things worked. In a town this size, the stain of an accusation like that never truly washed away. It explained the caution in her eyes, the wall she kept firmly in place. He felt a pang of sympathy for her, but it was quickly overshadowed by a new, chilling discovery. He scrolled through the list of initial plaintiffs, the local business owners and subcontractors who had joined Malloy's lawsuit, claiming they too had suffered financial losses. He zoomed in on the scanned signature page. There were a dozen names, and near the bottom, written in a familiar, steady cursive, was his own, Calder Hayes. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding against his ribs. It was undeniably his signature, but he had absolutely no memory of signing that document. He had never done business with Grant Malloy, had never invested in any of his projects. He was a plumber who fixed leaky pipes and broken water heaters. He had no connection to that world of high-stakes finance and development. A cold dread washed over him. He was not just a stranger who had offered her a ride. He was one of the people who had publicly, legally, accused her of a crime. His perception of the last 24 hours fractured and reformed into a terrifying new shape. The car in the snowdrift, the dead phone, her cryptic question. Was it all a coincidence? Or was it a meticulously planned act of revenge? The red herring was now firmly in place, a dark and menacing possibility. He saw her not as a person in need, but as a potential threat living under his roof, sleeping just one door down from his son. His instinct to protect Theo surged, sharp and fierce. He looked out the office door toward the living room. Ivy was on the floor, helping Theo place the final cushion on his pillow fort. Theo was laughing, a pure, happy sound that now seemed horribly fragile. Ivy looked up, and her eyes met Calder's through the doorway. She smiled, a small, genuine smile. And in that moment, as Theo leaned against her, and said something Calder couldn't hear. Ivy leaned in close and whispered back to the boy, her voice too low to carry, but her words clear in their intent. "Your dad's a good man," she murmured, her expression unreadable. "But nobody believes good men around here." The discovery of his own signature on the old lawsuit document had erected an invisible wall between Calder and the rest of the house. He spent the remainder of the day in a state of quiet, hyper-vigilant observation. Every interaction between Ivy and Theo, every shared laugh over the pillow fort, every casual question she asked, was filtered through a lens of deep suspicion. He was polite, his voice even, but the warmth had vanished from his hospitality. He felt like a stranger in his own home, guarding his son from a threat he couldn't yet name or define. The woman who had been a victim just a day ago was now a calculating presence, her motives a dark, unreadable script. He kept replaying her whispered words to Theo. "Nobody believes good men around here." It had sounded like a warning. Now it felt like a threat. He needed answers, but he couldn't confront her directly, not while Theo was awake, a small, innocent satellite orbiting the tense gravity between the two adults. He needed something concrete, something that explained how his name ended up on a legal document he had never, ever seen. After dinner, once Theo was finally asleep, a fragile peace fell over the house. Ivy was reading a book on the armchair, the one Lena used to love, and the sight sent a fresh wave of resentment through him. He excused himself, retreating again to the small office, closing the door behind him. The room was cold, filled with the ghosts of unpaid bills and the lingering scent of old paper. He didn't turn on the computer this time. The digital signature was a dead end. What he needed was a physical trace, a memory. He began to search, his movements methodical and quiet. He pulled out old file boxes from the closet, the cardboard soft with age. He sifted through years of receipts, invoices for plumbing supplies, old tax returns, the mundane artifacts of his life. He was looking for any correspondence, any mention of Grant Malloy or his development company. He found nothing. His business and Malloy's were in different universes. The signature remained an impossibility, a tear in the fabric of his own history. His frustration grew, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. The search felt futile. He was a man who dealt in the tangible world of copper pipes and water pressure, not in the murky depths of legal deceit. He left the office and walked back into the living room, his eyes scanning the space, searching for something out of place, for a memory he'd overlooked. His gaze fell upon the mantelpiece. It was the heart of the home, a curated collection of their lives. He looked at the pictures of Theo, at the photo of his parents, and then his eyes landed on the frame that held his favorite picture of Lena. It was taken on a hike a year before she passed away, the sunlight filtering through the trees, catching the gold in her hair. She was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that he missed with an ache that was still sharp. He remembered her putting the picture in that specific frame, an ornate silver one he had bought her for their anniversary. He remembered her struggling with the back of it, saying the clasps were too tight. An instinct, sharp and sudden, took hold. He walked over and picked up the frame. It was heavier than it looked. He ran his thumb along the velvet backing. Just as he remembered, it was sealed tight. But as he examined it more closely, he saw that one edge of the backing wasn't perfectly flush with the frame. It was slightly raised, almost imperceptibly so. Using his thumbnail, he pried at the edge. It resisted for a moment, then gave way with a soft crackle of old glue. The backing came loose. Tucked between the velvet and the wooden insert was a small, folded piece of stationery, yellowed with age. His heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was Lena's, her elegant looping script instantly recognizable. It was a letter, but it had no salutation. It was a confession. "I don't know who will read this, or when," it began. I only know I can't carry this anymore. Grant Malloy is not the man this town thinks he is. He came to me, to the firm, with a problem. A young analyst had discovered something, a discrepancy in the funding for the Lakeside project. Her name was Ivy Sloane. She was smart, and she was honest, and she was going to report it. Malloy couldn't have that. He has people everywhere, people who owe him. He threatened us. Not with violence, not directly. He threatened our futures. He talked about how easy it would be for a small plumbing business to fail an inspection, to lose its license over a technicality. He talked about you, Calder. He knew everything. Calder had to sit down. The words swam before his eyes. He read on, his breath held tight in his chest. He drew up a false statement, a testimony claiming Ivy was the one committing fraud. He needed signatories, people to give it weight. He forced my boss to sign, and then he forced me. He said it was for my family's protection. I signed it. I lied. I stood by while they destroyed that girl's reputation to protect his own. I testified against an innocent woman. I don't know how to live with it. The world tilted on its axis. The image of his wife, righteous, kind, his moral compass, shattered into a million pieces. She had lied. She had participated in a crime, destroyed someone's life, all while living under his roof, sleeping in his bed. The grief he felt was swiftly consumed by a profound, disorienting betrayal. And into that void, a new theory rushed in, ugly and potent. This explained everything. Ivy wasn't here for revenge, she was a blackmailer. She must have known about this letter all along. Her car breaking down, her appearance in the storm. It was all a charade. She had waited years, waited until Lena was gone, and now she was here to collect. She was using his son's affection, his own hospitality, as leverage. The kindness he had shown her felt like a fool's error. The power imbalance he had felt in the storm was real, but he had gotten it all wrong. He wasn't the rescuer. He was the mark. He folded the letter, the paper crinkling in his trembling hand, and slid it into his pocket. The warmth from the fireplace no longer felt comforting. It felt suffocating. He stood up, his jaw set, his decision made. He walked out of the office and into the living room. Ivy looked up from her book, her expression calm, questioning. He looked at her, and for the first time, he felt no sympathy, no confusion, only a cold, clear anger. He would play her game for one more night. He would not give her the satisfaction of a confrontation. But in the morning, when the roads were clear, he would drive her into town. He wouldn't take her to a bus station. He would take her straight to the sheriff's office, hand them Lena's letter, and let the law unravel the whole damned thing. He had a son to protect, and he would not let his wife's ghost, or this woman's greed, put him in danger. The morning broke cold and unforgivingly bright. Every surface of snow reflected the sun, creating a landscape of harsh, sterile white. The tension inside the house was just as stark. Calder moved with a rigid, deliberate purpose, his movements sharp, his words clipped. He made pancakes for Theo, avoiding Ivy's gaze as she sat at the table. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. He could feel her watching him, could feel the weight of her presence, and it fueled the cold fire of his resolve. He saw Lena's letter, tucked in his pocket, as a shield. It was proof. It was his justification. He was protecting his son, protecting his wife's memory from the woman he now believed was a predator. "Theo, go get your boots on," Calder said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We're going to drive Ivy into town." Theo, oblivious, cheered at the prospect of a ride in the truck. Ivy didn't move. She simply placed her fork down, her expression one of profound disappointment, not surprise. It was as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, this inevitable verdict. "So that's it then," she said, her voice low and steady. "You found something, and you made up your mind." "Get your coat," Calder said, ignoring her question. His jaw was a hard line. "It's time for you to go." He would not be drawn into a debate. He would not give her an opening to spin another lie. He would drive her to the sheriff's station, place the letter in the deputy's hand, and walk away. It was clean. It was final. "The sheriff's office, Calder? Is that where you're taking me?" she asked. The question was so direct, so unnervingly accurate, that it stopped him in his tracks. He turned to face her. "You think Lena's letter is a confession, don't you? You think I'm here to blackmail you with it?" His silence was her answer. A sad, bitter smile touched her lips. "Of course you do. That's what he counts on. He knows that good people will always choose the simplest story, especially when it's ugly." She stood up, her movements no longer hesitant. A new strength seemed to flow into her, a strength born of having nothing left to lose. "Did you read the words she wrote, Calder? Not just the facts, but the fear behind them? She wasn't confessing to a crime. She was crying for help in the only way she knew how. She wrote that letter because she was terrified of what Grant Malloy would do to you." The name spoken aloud in his kitchen felt like a violation. "Don't," he warned, his voice a low growl. "He threatened her," Ivy pressed on, her voice rising with an urgent intensity. The sentences came faster now, sharp and percussive. "He didn't threaten her life. He was smarter than that. He threatened yours. He knew you were a small business owner, an honest one. He talked about how easy it would be for a plumber to fail a state inspection. A little paperwork mistake, a disgruntled anonymous client. Your license would be suspended. Your livelihood would be gone. He used you, Calder. He used you to control her. She didn't betray you. She signed that false testimony to protect you." Every word was a blow. Calder felt his certainty begin to crack, hairline fractures spreading through the foundation of his anger. He pulled the letter from his pocket, his hand shaking. He talked about how easy it would be for a small plumbing business to fail an inspection. He talked about you, Calder. The words were there. He had read them, but he hadn't understood them. He had been so blinded by his own sense of betrayal that he had missed the truth hiding in plain sight. "Why should I believe you?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Because she didn't just abandon me after the trial," Ivy said, her voice softening, breaking with a grief that felt raw and real. She held up her wrist, the silver bracelet catching the morning light. "You think I wore this to manipulate you? A callback to a random act of kindness?" She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "Lena gave this to me. We met in secret, a month after the charges were dropped. She was a wreck. She was trapped, suffocating with guilt. She told me everything. She gave me this bracelet and made me a promise. She said the wren is small, but its song is one of the loudest in the forest. She promised she would find a way to sing the truth, no matter how long it took." The midpoint reversal was complete. The narrative he had constructed, the blackmailer, the victimized husband, crumbled into dust. He wasn't the target of a con. He was the reason for his wife's silence. He was the cage she had been locked in. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had misjudged Ivy. He had misjudged Lena. He had spent the last 24 hours despising a woman who was, in fact, his wife's last hope. "She tried," Ivy continued, seeing the shift in his eyes. "She started gathering things, making copies of documents from the firm. Anything that could connect the dots back to Malloy's fraud. But she got sick before she could finish. The cancer was too fast." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Before she died, she sent me a package. It contained her letter to you and one other thing." Ivy walked over to her coat, which was still hanging by the door. She reached into the inner pocket and pulled out a small, plain object. It was a black USB flash drive. "This is everything," she said, holding it out to him. It lay in her palm like a small, dark seed. "It's the original file I copied from the server, the one I found all those years ago, the one that shows exactly how Malloy laundered the money from the Lakeside project. It's the proof that gets both of us justice, her and me." Calder stared at the drive. It felt impossibly heavy, the repository of all the lies and all the truth. His anger had evaporated, replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a new and dangerous clarity. The enemy was no longer a ghost in his house. He had a name and a face. Grant Malloy. The blizzard hadn't brought a threat to his door. It had delivered an obligation. "My car didn't get stuck by accident, Calder," Ivy said quietly. "The storm was just cover. I had to get to you. I had to know if the man Lena tried so desperately to protect was the man who would finally help her keep her promise." He took the USB drive from her hand. His fingers closed around the cool plastic. The house was no longer a fortress to defend. It was a base of operations. The question was no longer how to get her out. It was how they were going to fight back. The town hall was packed, a sea of familiar faces under the harsh fluorescent lights. The air hummed with a low-grade civic anxiety, the usual mix of property tax complaints and zoning disputes. No one was prepared for what was coming. Calder stood at the back, Ivy beside him, the USB drive a cold, dense weight in his pocket. He scanned the crowd. Neighbors he had known his whole life, men he shared a beer with, women who had taught Theo in Sunday school. And in the front row, holding court like a king in his throne room, was Grant Malloy. He was laughing, shaking hands, the picture of untouchable local power. Calder's hands clenched into fists. For a moment his courage faltered. He was just a plumber. This was not his world. Then he felt a light touch on his arm. It was Ivy. She didn't say anything, but her eyes, clear and resolute, met his. "We do this for her." The thought was a silent pact between them. The public comment period began. A farmer complained about deer eating his crops. A librarian requested more funding. Then Ivy walked to the podium. A murmur went through the room. People recognized her, the ghost of a scandal from 7 years ago. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but carried an undeniable strength that cut through the noise. "My name is Ivy Sloane," she began. "7 years ago, many of you were told I was a thief. You were told I committed fraud against this town's most generous benefactor, Mr. Grant Malloy." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the room, finally landing on Malloy himself, whose smile had become a thin, hard line. "You were told a lie." The room erupted in whispers. Ivy ignored them. She calmly walked to the projector, unplugged the town manager's laptop, and inserted the USB drive. "The truth has been buried for a long time," she said, her back to the crowd, as a folder appeared on the large screen behind her. "Tonight, we're digging it up." She clicked open the first file. It was a spreadsheet, dense with numbers, account codes, and dates. Lines of highlighted text showed money being moved from the Lakeside Development Fund into a series of shell corporations. The data was complex, overwhelming, but the pattern was clear. It was a masterclass in theft, hiding in plain sight. Ivy's voice was the steady narration to the crime, explaining each transaction. Her past as a financial analyst now a weapon. Grant Malloy shot to his feet. "This is an outrage!" he boomed, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "This is a public meeting, not a stage for the fantasies of a disgraced criminal. This woman is a known liar, and she is using doctored documents to slander my good name." He turned his charisma on the crowd, the weapon he had honed for decades. "Are we really going to listen to this? To a bitter woman with a 7-year-old grudge? And him," he said, pointing a finger directly at Calder, who felt 100 pairs of eyes turn on him. "A man so lost in his grief he's been taken in by her lies. This is a circus, and I will not stand for it." The momentum shifted. Malloy was powerful, persuasive. The spreadsheet was just numbers. But Malloy was a person, a pillar of their community. Doubt began to creep across the faces in the audience. They saw a grieving widower and a woman with a tarnished past. They saw a powerful man defending his honor. The narrative was simple, compelling. The red herring that Calder himself had fallen for was now being fed to the entire town. A young man near the back held up his phone, the small red light indicating he was live streaming. The whole town was watching, and they were beginning to side with Malloy. Just as Ivy seemed to falter, her evidence being dismissed as nothing more than a personal vendetta, Calder moved. He walked past her, up to the podium, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was not a public speaker. His hands shook, not from fear, but from a deep, resonant rage. He didn't look at the spreadsheet. He looked at the people. "My name is Calder Hayes," he said, his voice rougher, less polished than Malloy's. "Most of you know me. You know I fix your pipes. You know I'm Theo's dad. And most of you knew my wife, Lena." At the mention of her name, a hush fell over the room. Lena had been loved. "I didn't believe Ivy either," Calder confessed, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought she was a threat. I was going to turn her over to the police. Until I found this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded, yellowed piece of stationery. It looked fragile, sacred, in his calloused hand. "This is a letter. It's from my wife. She wrote it a few months before she died." He unfolded it. He didn't need to read it all. He knew the words by heart. "Grant Malloy is not the man this town thinks he is," Calder read, his voice gaining strength. The room was utterly silent. Malloy's face had gone pale. "He threatened our futures. He talked about how easy it would be for a small plumbing business to fail an inspection, to lose its license over a technicality. He talked about you, Calder. He used you to control me. I signed that false testimony. I testified against an innocent woman to protect my family." He let the words hang in the air. This was not data. This was not a grudge. This was a confession from the grave. A voice they all knew and trusted. It was the emotional proof that shattered Malloy's carefully constructed reality. The payoff was devastating. Calder looked directly at Malloy, whose mask of indignation had crumbled, revealing the panicked, cornered man beneath. "You didn't just ruin Ivy's life," Calder said, his voice low and shaking with fury. "You used my wife's love for me as a weapon against her. You let her die with that guilt." The tide didn't just turn. It was a tsunami. The whispers became angry murmurs. The phone live-streaming the event was now joined by a dozen others. The court of public opinion had delivered its verdict. 2 sheriff's deputies, who had been standing at the back of the hall, began to move forward, their expressions grim, their path toward the front row slow and deliberate. Grant Malloy looked from the deputies to the sea of accusing faces, and then to the letter in Calder's hand. For the first time, the most powerful man in town had nowhere left to run. He had been exposed, not by a spreadsheet, but by a dead woman's love for her husband. Calder and Ivy stood together, watching as the shadows that had haunted them for so long were finally dragged into the light. The world was filled with the gentle sound of dripping water. The sun, a pale but determined winter gold, had climbed high into the sky, and its warmth was beginning to undo the blizzard's work. Water trickled from the eaves of the house, ran in small, clean rivers down the driveway, and dripped from the heavy branches of the pine trees. The harsh, silent white of the past few days was receding, revealing the dark, honest earth beneath. It was a morning of thawing, both outside and in. The news from town had traveled fast, delivered via a single brief phone call from Sheriff Miller an hour after dawn. Grant Malloy was in custody, his network of influence unraveling with astonishing speed as others, emboldened by the events at the town hall, began to come forward with their own stories. Justice, it turned out, was a lot like the melting snow. Once it started moving, it was difficult to stop. Ivy's car, which Calder had towed from the ditch and parked in his driveway, was now clear of snow. She had packed her small bag, and the house had returned to its familiar state of quiet. But the nature of the quiet had changed. It was no longer heavy with suspicion or unspoken grief. It was calm, settled, a place of rest. Theo sat at the kitchen table, carefully drawing a picture with a green crayon. It was a T-Rex, but this time it was standing next to a small bird with a bright silver wing. He was making it for Ivy, a farewell gift. Calder stood on the porch, watching Ivy as she placed her bag in the back seat of her sedan. She ran a hand over the jagged scratch on the passenger door. A small, thoughtful gesture, a nod to the wound that had started it all. "The roads should be clear all the way to Northwood," Calder said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet morning air. "Are you sure you don't want to stay another day? Just to rest?" Ivy turned, a real smile reaching her eyes for the first time. It transformed her face, erasing the years of caution and weariness. "I've been resting for 7 years, Calder," she said softly. "I think I'm ready to start moving forward now." She walked over to him, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. For a moment, they just stood there. Two people bound by a storm and a promise made by a woman they had both loved in different ways. There was nothing left that needed to be said. They had stood together in the harsh light of the town hall, had faced down the same shadow, and had emerged into this new, clean morning. It was enough. Theo came running out, holding his drawing. "This is for you," he said, pressing the paper into her hand. "So you don't forget us." Ivy knelt, her eyes level with his. She looked at the drawing, at the impossible friendship between a dinosaur and a wren, and her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I could never forget you, Theo," she whispered, wrapping him in a tight hug. "You remind me that it's always safe to trust the good guys." She held him for a long moment, then stood and faced Calder. "Thank you," she said, the two words carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "For stopping." "I'm glad I did," he said, and he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that it was the truest thing he had ever said. She got into her car, started the engine, and with a final wave, she drove away, the silver sedan growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared around the bend. Calder stood on the porch, Theo's hand in his, watching the empty road. The air was cool, but for the first time since the snow had started to melt, it didn't feel cold. It felt fresh, clean, like the first true day of a long-awaited spring. He looked down and saw something lying on the top step of the porch, sparkling in the sunlight. He bent down and picked it up. It was the silver bracelet. The delicate chain had snapped, likely in the commotion of the previous night. It was broken, a fractured circle, but as he held it in his palm, the small, intricately carved wren caught the light, shining with a fierce, undiminished brilliance. He closed his hand around it, the cool metal a familiar weight. He remembered its glint in his headlights, a flash of suspicion in the heart of the storm. He remembered seeing it on her wrist in his kitchen, a clue to a past he couldn't grasp. Now, its meaning had changed one last time. It was no longer a mystery. It was a testament, a symbol of a promise kept, of a song finally sung. It was a piece of Lena's courage and a piece of Ivy's resilience. He slid the broken bracelet into his pocket, next to his wife's letter. He looked out at the thawing world, at his son standing beside him, and he smiled. His act of kindness in the middle of a blizzard had not invited chaos into his life. It had brought him the truth. It had brought him peace.